They tied her to a chair in a burning house, a diary pressed against her ribs, the only proof that could save an innocent man. The killer smiled and said, "Give me the diary, or the Boston girl dies first." She lifted her chin. She did not give it up. But this story did not begin in fire. It began on an auction block where a woman was sold for the price of a horse. The ranch was already burning when Evie Harding understood what the word "sold" truly meant. Not the way it sounded on the auction block in Denver City 3 weeks ago when a fat man with tobacco teeth called her lot number 7 and men bid on her like she was a sack of grain. Not even the way it felt riding into the mountains wedged between two strangers whose names made an entire town go quiet. No. She understood it now. Standing in the dirt yard of Drummond Creek Ranch with smoke pouring black against the stars, a leather diary pressed flat against her ribs beneath her dress, and Garrett Holloway pointing a revolver at her face with the patience of a man who had killed before and would kill again without losing a minute of sleep. Silas Drummond stood 3 feet to her left. Blood ran from a gash on his right forearm and dripped slow off his knuckles onto the packed earth. He held a rifle in his other hand, the barrel steady despite everything. His gray eyes had gone past cold into something she had no name for, something that made her think of January rivers, the kind that look still on top but will drag you under and never give you back. Caleb Drummond knelt on one knee to her right. His left shoulder was torn open where a bullet had kissed through muscle and come out the back. His face was black with soot, his teeth bared against the pain, but his dark brown eyes burned brighter than the fire eating the barn behind them. He was trying to stand. He kept trying. Holloway adjusted his grip on the revolver and smiled. That was the worst part. The smile. It was the kind of smile you might see on a banker or a deacon, a generous man at a church supper, a man you would trust with your land, your cattle, your children. "Give me the diary," Holloway said calmly, "or the Boston girl dies first." Silas shifted his weight forward. 1 inch, 2. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw beneath that dark beard and made him look carved from stone. "She is not something for you to price," Silas said. His voice was low and rough and did not waver, like a rock dropping into a deep well. But this story did not begin in fire. It began 3 weeks earlier on a wooden platform in the middle of Denver City where a young woman from Boston was sold for the price of a horse, and 2 shadows stepped out of the crowd like ghosts coming down from the mountains. 3 weeks earlier, September 1883. The dress had once been beautiful. Blue cotton with small white flowers stitched along the hem, bought 3 years ago for her cousin's wedding in Boston. Back then it had fit her perfectly. Back then Evelyn Harding had been a professor's daughter, a young woman who read books by candlelight and spoke about poetry at the breakfast table and truly believed that the world had a place for a girl who loved words. Now the dress hung loose on her thin frame, stained brown and gray from weeks of hard travel. The hem was torn halfway up. The sleeves had faded to the color of dishwater. And Evie stood on a wooden platform in the center of Denver City's main square, trying to remember who she used to be, because now she was lot number 7. The auctioneer, a round man named Horace Pudge, shuffled papers in his fat hands without looking at her. His teeth were stained the color of wet tobacco. His vest was too tight. He smelled of whiskey and onion, and to him she was no different than a wagon wheel or a barrel of salt pork, something to be sold, something to be traded, something with a price tag where a name used to be. The Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency, they called it, a polite name for a desperate arrangement. Women with no options standing on platforms while men with no wives studied them like livestock at a county fair. This was the edge of the frontier in 1883, where loneliness was as common as dust, and a good wife was worth more than a gold claim. Evie kept her spine straight. She lifted her chin. If she was going to be sold like cattle, she would not bow her head. Her father had taught her that much. Professor William Harding of Boston had believed in education, not just for his students at Harvard, but for his daughter. He had taught her Shakespeare before she turned 10, Latin by 12, French by 14. He read her philosophy at breakfast and debated ethics with her over supper, and he never once told her that her mind mattered less because she was a girl. He told her something else instead, something she carried like a stone in her chest. Dignity, he used to say, setting down his coffee cup with that careful precision she loved, is the one thing no one can take from you. Not poverty, not cruelty, not even death. The only way to lose your dignity is to hand it over yourself. He died when she was 15. Pneumonia. It took him in 6 days. Her mother followed 2 years later, quieter, slower, as if she simply could not find a reason to keep breathing in a world that no longer contained William Harding. After that, Evie became a burden. Her Uncle James took her in because that was what families did. But he never let her forget his generosity. She worked as a governess for his 3 children without pay. She mended their clothes, prepared their lessons, wiped their noses. She ate at their table as if it were a favor being granted each night, and she listened to her Aunt Harriet whisper about extra mouths and wasted money and that girl who reads too much for her own good. When Uncle James decided to move west to seek his fortune in the territories, Evie had no choice but to follow. A woman alone in Boston in 1881 had few options, and none of them good. But Uncle James never reached the West. He died of cholera at a river crossing in Missouri. Went gray in the face at breakfast, was dead by supper time. Evie held a damp cloth to his forehead for 6 hours while the life drained out of him, and when it was done, Aunt Harriet looked at her with eyes as flat and cold as river stones. She waited exactly 1 day. "You should have died instead of him," her aunt said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. At least he was useful. They left Evie at a trading post with nothing but the dress on her back and the education in her head. No money, no letters of introduction, no family name that meant anything west of the Mississippi. She survived. That was the word for it. Not lived, survived. She washed laundry for pennies. She mended torn coats. She slept in barns when barns were available and under wagons when they were not. She ate scraps. She walked when she had no ride. She kept moving west because stopping meant dying, and she was not ready to die. The Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency found her in a boarding house in Denver, half-starved, hollow-eyed, gripping a copy of Marcus Aurelius. She had somehow kept through everything. They offered food, shelter, warmth. In return, she would stand on this platform and let men bid for her hand. It was not the future she had imagined, but it was a future, and futures were hard to come by for a woman with nothing. Pudge cleared his throat with a sound like a boot pulling out of mud. "Lot number 7, he announced, reading from his paper. "Evelyn Harding, 24 years of age, Boston, Massachusetts." He glanced up at the crowd, then back at his notes. "Educated, literate, capable of managing a household and instructing children. No family, no prior marriage." He paused, licked his lips. "Virtue guaranteed." A murmur passed through the crowd of men gathered below the platform. Miners with rough hands and rougher manners, ranchers with sharp eyes and sun-cracked skin, drifters, prospectors, men who had come to the edge of the known world because the known world had no use for them, and now they stared at Evie like they were studying a horse before purchase. She forced herself not to react. Her cheeks burned, but she would not show shame. Shame was a luxury she could not afford. Not today. The bidding began at $50, the price of a horse, the price of her entire life. A miner raised his hand. $60. He was thick-bodied with a gold tooth that flashed when he grinned. He looked at Evie the way a dog looks at a bone. There was no kindness in it, no curiosity, just appetite. $75. An older rancher. His belly pressed tight against his vest. His eyes lingered in places they should not have lingered, and Evie felt her skin crawl beneath her dress. $80. $90. $100. They went back and forth while she stood perfectly still, and not one of them asked what she wanted. Not one of them cared. She was merchandise. Lot number 7. Blue dress, white flowers, virtue guaranteed. The bidding stopped at $100. The rancher smiled in victory, his fat cheeks lifting like risen dough. Pudge raised his gavel. "Going once." The crowd shifted. Not slowly, not the lazy drift of curious men. Quickly. Men stepped aside, some of them stumbling, clearing space like something dangerous was approaching from behind. Evie leaned forward slightly on the platform. Her heart was suddenly pounding for a reason she could not explain. Then she saw them. Not one man. Two. They came through the crowd like stones dropped into still water, and the ripples moved outward fast. Men pressed back. Conversations died. Someone near the front made a sound that was not quite a word, something between recognition and fear. The first man was the largest human being Evie had ever seen. He stood a full head above the tallest man in the crowd, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. He wore a long coat made of animal hide, scarred and weathered by years of mountain weather. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick black beard covered most of his face. But it was his eyes that held her. Gray, cold, like a storm gathering over the highest peaks, the kind you watch from a distance, because getting close means you do not come back. He moved with a strange, deliberate stillness, no wasted motion, no hurry, like a man who had learned a long time ago that the world would wait for him or it would get out of his way. The second man walked one step behind and to the right. He was shorter than the first by a few inches, but wider through the chest, built like a blacksmith, which he was. His hands were enormous. His arms strained the seams of his coat. His hair was dark brown, pulled back and tied behind his neck with a leather cord, but it was his face that drew the eye. A scar ran from his left temple down across his cheekbone to the edge of his jaw, thick and white, the kind of scar that comes from a knife and tells a story nobody asks about twice. Where the first man was cold, this one burned. His dark brown eyes carried a heat that Evie could feel from the platform. Not the crude hunger of the miner, not the lazy appetite of the rancher. Something else. Something that flickered between anger and protectiveness, like a fire that could warm you or consume you depending on which way the wind blew. Whispers now, moving through the crowd like wind through dry grass. The Drummond brothers. I thought they were dead. 8 years in the mountains. Pudge swallowed hard. His gavel hand trembled. "Mr. Drummond," he said, and it was not clear which one he was addressing. What brings you gentlemen down from your mountain?" The tall one did not look at Pudge. He looked only at Evie. Not the way the miner had looked. Not the way the rancher had looked. He studied her as if he were reading a book, as if she were a passage written in a language he had almost forgotten, and he was trying to remember what the words meant. $150, he said quietly. His voice was deep and rough, the voice of a man who did not speak often and did not waste words when he did. He did not shout, but everyone heard. Evie heard it in her chest. The rancher cleared his throat. $160. $250. It was the second man who spoke. His voice was different from his brother's, hotter, sharper, like steel fresh from the forge, still glowing. He did not look at the rancher. He looked at Evie, and in that look was something she would spend weeks trying to name. $250. Silence dropped over the square like a blanket smothering a flame. That was a fortune. A man could buy 3 horses for that, 5 acres of farmland, a year's provisions. The rancher stepped back. No one else spoke. Pudge's hand shook as he raised the gavel. $250 going once, going twice. The gavel struck wood. Sold. To the Drummond brothers. Sold. The word rang in Evie's ears like a church bell in an empty town. Sold. Not to one man, to 2. The tall one, Silas, stepped forward. He tossed a leather pouch of coins to Pudge without looking the way you might toss a bone to a dog. "Her belongings," he said. "I have none," Evie answered softly. Her voice surprised her. It was steadier than she felt. Everything was lost on the journey. Silas nodded once, a single motion like a door closing. "Follow us," he said. That was all. No welcome, no explanation, no kind words or soft promises, just a command delivered in that low, rough voice that made the air feel heavier. The second one Caleb moved before she stepped down from the platform. He shrugged off his coat, a heavy thing made of tanned hide and lined with wool, and draped it over her shoulders without a word. The warmth of his body was still in it. The weight settled on her like an arm around her back, and for one confused moment Evie felt safer than she had in months. She stepped down. Her legs trembled, but she locked her knees and forced them steady. She would not appear weak. Not before these men, not before this crowd, not before whatever came next. They walked through Denver City in silence. The crowd parted and stayed parted. People watched from doorways and windows, some with curiosity, some with what looked very much like fear. Two massive horses stood tied at the edge of town, black as coal, both of them with shoulders like small mountains. Caleb walked beside her, close but not touching, close enough that his body blocked the wind, close enough that anyone approaching from her left would reach him first. She noticed that. It meant something, though she did not yet know what. "Long ride," Caleb said. His voice was low when he spoke to her, lower than when he had called out that bid, almost gentle, though the word did not sit right next to the scar on his face. "Can you ride?" "Yes. It has been years, though." "You will ride with my brother. His horse is stronger for two." Before she could respond, Silas's hands were on her waist. He lifted her into the saddle as easily as lifting a child, and the sudden closeness of it, his hands, his strength, the effortless way he moved her made her breath catch in her throat. He mounted in front of her. "Hold on." She wrapped her arms around his waist and felt the solid wall of muscle beneath his coat. He smelled of pine resin and tanned leather and wood smoke. Not unpleasant, just wild. Like something that belonged outdoors in high places far from towns and talking and the sound of a gavel striking wood. Caleb rode beside them on the other horse. He did not speak, but every few minutes his eyes would sweep across to check on her. Each time Evie shifted on the saddle, each time her grip loosened, his hand would drift toward her ready to catch before she even realized she was slipping. Silas never seemed to notice. Caleb always did. Two ways of protecting, she thought. One like a wall, one like a hand. They rode out of Denver City as the sun began to set and the sky turned the color of a wound closing. Hours passed in silence. Grasslands turned to forest. Cottonwoods gave way to pine, and the air grew colder with each mile as the mountains rose before them like the spine of some enormous sleeping creature. The trail narrowed. Rocks replaced dirt. The horses picked their way upward with the patience of animals that knew this path by heart. She should have been terrified. She was riding into the wilderness with two men who made an entire town go quiet. Men she did not know. Men who had bought her for reasons she did not yet understand. But terror was not what she felt. Instead, something strange stirred in her chest, a feeling she barely recognized because it had been absent so long. Not fear. Not exactly hope. Something in between. The feeling of a door opening in a house you thought had no more doors. When full dark came, Silas stopped near a stream where the water ran clear over flat stones. He dismounted and helped her down, hands on her waist again, and this time she was ready for it and met his eyes as he set her on the ground. His gray gaze held hers for half a breath. Then he turned away. Caleb already had his knife out. He disappeared into the trees and came back 20 minutes later with 2 rabbits cleaned and skinned with the efficient hands of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He built a spit from green branches and roasted the meat over the fire Silas had built, and the smell of it made Evie's empty stomach clench with hunger. They ate in silence. The fire crackled. Stars appeared overhead in numbers Evie had never seen in Boston, as if someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. She asked the question that had been burning inside her since the gavel fell. "Why did you buy me?" Silas stared into the fire. The light moved across his face, softening the hard lines, finding something almost human beneath the stone. "We have a niece," he said. 6 years old. Evie blinked. Of all the answers she had imagined, this was not one. "She needs someone to care for her." Silas continued, each word careful and heavy, as if he were lifting stones into place. "To teach her. We cannot." "You bought me for her." "Yes." Caleb answered from the other side of the fire. His voice was softer when he spoke of the child. The heat in his eyes banked down to something warmer. Her parents died. She barely speaks since the day it happened. Her parents died. Evie heard the words and felt them land in the hollow place below her ribs where her own losses lived. "How did they die?" she asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. He glanced at Silas. "They said it was a wagon accident," Caleb said finally. "They said." 2 words carrying weight far beyond their size. Not "it was." They said it was. Evie was a professor's daughter. She understood the difference between a fact and a story someone told you. She did not press further. Not yet. It was too soon, and the fire was too small for the size of whatever truth lived behind those 2 words. "I will do my best for her," Evie said gently. Silas looked at her fully for the first time since Denver. Surprise moved through his gray eyes like a fish breaking the surface of a still pond. Quick, almost invisible, but there. "Most women would be angry," he said. "I have been angry," Evie replied calmly. "But anger does not change circumstances. Only choices do." Caleb made a sound. Low, quiet, almost a laugh, but surprised out of him. He looked at Silas. "You were right," he said. "She is not what we expected." Evie looked at both of them. 2 men sitting across a fire in the middle of nowhere, one cold as granite, one hot as forge iron, both watching her with expressions she was only beginning to learn to read. "What I expect from you," she said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice, "is the truth, and that no one lays a hand on me." Caleb's eyes went dark. Not with anger, with something fiercer. "No one touches you unless you want them to. That is my word." Silas nodded once. The same single heavy motion. A door closing on a promise that would not be opened again. "Sleep," Silas said. "We ride early." Caleb handed her a blanket. Then Silas laid his own beneath her without being asked, a barrier between her body and the cold ground. 2 blankets. 2 men. 2 different kinds of care offered without explanation. Evie lay beneath the stars and listened to the stream and the fire and the slow breathing of 2 mountain men who had bought her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. She was alone in the wilderness with strangers. She had no money, no family, no home, no name that meant anything to anyone alive. And yet, she did not feel as alone as she had in Boston. Something about that thought stayed with her as she closed her eyes. Something about the careful way Silas built the fire in a ring of stones to block the wind from reaching her. Something about the way Caleb positioned himself between her bedroll and the dark edge of the forest, his knife across his knee, his eyes on the tree line. 2 walls, 2 different shapes, both built around the same empty center, keeping something safe that did not yet have a name. The next day the land grew steeper. Forests thickened. The trail became less a trail and more a suggestion scratched into the mountainside by animals and stubbornness. Snow rested on the distant peaks like white hair on old men, and the air thinned until each breath felt like it needed earning. Caleb rode closer now. The trail was narrow enough that his knee sometimes brushed against Evie's leg where she sat behind Silas, and each time it happened she felt the contact like a small electric shock, quick and sharp, and she told herself it meant nothing. Late afternoon. The sun hung low and orange through the pines. "Close now," Silas said. 2 words, but something in his voice had changed. Softer, almost fragile, as if the mountain man who frightened an entire town was suddenly afraid of something much smaller. They crested a ridge and the world opened below them. A small valley, a clear stream winding through it like a silver ribbon, a sturdy log cabin near the water with smoke curling from a stone chimney, a barn, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden with late-season squash still on the vine. And standing in the doorway of the cabin, barely tall enough to reach the latch, a little girl clutching a rag doll. Dark hair hanging loose past her shoulders, a face pale and too serious for her age, eyes that looked like they had seen something no 6-year-old should see and decided the safest response was silence. "That is Rosie," Silas said quietly. And there it was again, that different voice, the one that did not match the gray eyes or the broad shoulders or the reputation that made grown men cross the street. This voice was careful, tender, the voice of a man holding something that might break. They rode down into the valley. Caleb was off his horse before it stopped crossing the yard in long strides, dropping to his knees in front of the child. Rosie threw her arms around his neck and held on, and Caleb closed his eyes and pressed his scarred face against her dark hair. Silas dismounted and knelt beside them. He did not touch the child right away. He waited. Then his large hand settled on her head, stroking her hair twice with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that size. Rosie did not hug him, but she did not pull away either. "This is Evie," Silas said. "She will stay with us." Rosie looked at Evie over Caleb's shoulder. Cautious eyes, measuring eyes, the eyes of a child who had learned that people leave and do not come back. Evie crouched down slowly. No sudden movements, no false brightness. "Hello, Rosie. Your doll is beautiful. Does she have a name?" "Daisy." A whisper. "Mama made her." Evie felt her heart clench like a fist closing. "Your mama must have loved you very much." "She is dead." Blunt, flat, the way children say terrible things because they have not yet learned to soften them. "My parents are dead too," Evie said. Rosie's eyes widened, the first real expression Evie had seen on that small, pale face. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. The look of someone who discovers they are not the only person standing in a particular kind of dark. "Does it hurt?" Rosie asked. "Yes," Evie said honestly, "but it gets easier to carry." Rosie studied her for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Evie's hand. Her fingers were small and cold and surprisingly strong. "Come inside," she said quietly. Evie glanced back. Silas stood a few paces behind, watching the exchange with an expression she could not yet read. Relief maybe, hope possibly, gratitude certainly, but something else too, something deeper and more complicated that lived behind those gray eyes like a light in a window you see from very far away. Caleb stood closer. His dark eyes were warm, and he gave Evie a small nod. A simple gesture, but it said what words would have taken too long to arrange. "You did the right thing. She let you in." Evie stepped across the threshold of the cabin, Rosie's hand in hers, and she did not know that this simple doorway would become the border between the life she had survived and the life she had not yet dared to imagine. The cabin was warmer than she expected. A wide stone fireplace glowed with steady heat. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding jars and tools and tins arranged with a kind of rough order that spoke of discipline rather than decoration. A sturdy table stood at the center of the main room, built from thick planks and sanded smooth by use. 2 chairs, a bench, an iron pot hanging over the fire. Everything was simple, but nothing was careless. This was the home of men who respected their own hands and the things those hands could make. Then she saw the books. They covered an entire wall, rows of them spine-to-spine leather bindings worn soft by years of handling. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing across titles she knew as well as her own name. Shakespeare, Milton, Plato, Aristotle, French novels, Latin texts. A collection that would not have been out of place in her father's study in Boston. These were not the books of an uneducated mountain brute. These were the books of a man who thought deeply and read widely and kept his mind alive the way other men kept their rifles oiled, with discipline, with devotion, in secret. "Those are Uncle Eli's," Rosie said, using her private name for Silas. "He reads them when he cannot sleep." Evie turned slowly. Silas stood near the door with an armload of firewood. His gray eyes met hers for one unguarded second, and in that second she saw something she had not expected. Not embarrassment, not defiance, something closer to vulnerability. The look of a man whose secret room had just been found. Then the shutters came down and his face was stone again. "You may read any of them," he said. "Books are meant to be read." "You read French?" she asked gently. "I did once." His answer carried the weight of something lost, a life before the mountains, a self he had left behind. Evie did not push, but she filed the information away the way her father had taught her, carefully, patiently. One piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. Rosie tugged her hand. "I will show you your room." 2 small bedrooms at the back of the cabin. One was Rosie's, cluttered with drawings and pine cones and a small wooden horse that Caleb had carved. The other had been cleared recently. A narrow bed beneath a window that faced the mountains, a small dresser against the wall, and a bookshelf, new. The wood still pale and fresh, the joints clean and tight. "Uncle Silas picked the books for your shelf," Rosie said. "Uncle Caleb built it." Evie stood in the doorway of this small plain room and felt something bloom in her chest that she could not explain. One brother had chosen the books, the other had built the shelf to hold them. 2 gifts, 2 languages of care. Neither one spoken aloud. "Thank you," she whispered, though neither man was in the room to hear it. That evening she cooked supper from what she found in the pantry. Beans, salt pork, fresh bread that Caleb had baked surprisingly. Silas ate quietly, his eyes on his plate. Caleb ate with genuine pleasure and told Evie it was better than anything he and his brother had managed in 8 years, which was not a high bar, he admitted, since most of their cooking involved burning meat over a fire and calling it done. Rosie watched Evie with shy curiosity, the way a bird watches from a branch. Not ready to come closer, but not flying away either. Then came the moment that changed something inside Evie that would never change back. She was washing dishes in a tin basin when she heard it. Silas's voice, but not the voice she knew, not the low, rough, carefully rationed voice that gave orders and answered questions in as few words as possible. This voice was different, softer, almost musical, the voice of a man reading aloud to a child he loved. Evie dried her hands and moved to the doorway of the main room. Silas sat in the chair by the fire with a book of fairy tales open across his knee. Rosie was curled against his broad chest, her dark head tucked beneath his chin, her eyes half closed. One of his massive arms held her steady. The other turned pages with a gentleness that seemed to belong to a different man entirely. And beside them, Caleb sat on the floor with his back against the chair. In his enormous blacksmith's hands, he held a needle and thread. He was sewing the torn arm of Daisy the rag doll. Each stitch was small and precise and patient. Hands that had hammered steel and swung axes and broken the bones of men who threatened his brother were now carefully, tenderly repairing a child's toy. Evie stood in that doorway and watched a feared mountain man hold a little girl as if she were made of glass, while his scarred brother mended a rag doll with fingers meant for war. Something shifted inside her then, quietly, permanently, the way a river changes course after a storm. You do not see it happen. You only know that the water flows differently now, and it will not go back. Rosie fell asleep. Caleb lifted her from Silas's arms and carried her to bed with the careful steps of a man crossing a frozen lake. Silas placed the mended doll beside her pillow. Then both men went outside. Evie followed them onto the porch. The night air was cold and sharp, and the stars were impossible. So many of them, so close, as if someone had punched holes in the floor of heaven and the light was leaking through. "She is lucky to have you both," Evie said quietly. Caleb leaned against the porch rail, pulling a short clay pipe from his pocket. He did not light it, just held it. A habit, she guessed, from some earlier life. "She has no one else," Caleb said. "Sometimes one person is enough," Silas replied from the shadows. "Rosie has 2, Evie said. Something passed between the brothers in the silence that followed, a look Evie could not decipher, the kind of look that comes from sharing a history too long and too heavy for words. "My father died when I was 15. Evie said, because the darkness and the stars and the cold air made it easier to say true things. My mother 2 years later. The silence changed, became something warmer, something shared. I am sorry, Silas said, and the way he said it, slow with weight, like a man laying a stone on a grave, told Evie that he meant it in a way most people do not when they say those words. I am too, Caleb said. Softer. 3 lonely souls under a sky full of stars, each carrying losses they did not speak about, each standing at the edge of something they did not yet have a name for. Evie went to bed that night and lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind move through the pines and the creek talk to itself over the rocks. She thought about her father's books and the books on Silas's wall. She thought about the scar on Caleb's face and the way he sewed a doll with hands made for iron. She thought about a little girl named Rosie who asked, "Does it hurt?" as if she already knew the answer and just needed someone to say it out loud. And she thought about the word sold, about how it had felt on that platform in Denver City, how it had tasted, bitter, metallic, like blood in your mouth after a blow. But here in this cabin with firelight dying to embers and 2 mountain men sleeping somewhere between her room and the door, the word was beginning to mean something different. She had been sold, yes, but she had also been chosen. And maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to choose back. That night somewhere she could not see, in a ranch house that had once belonged to the Drummond family, a man named Garrett Holloway sat at a stolen desk in a stolen room and listened to a report from a thin man with snake eyes and 2 guns on his hips. The Drummond brothers came down to Denver today, bought a woman at the auction. Holloway did not look up from the land deeds spread across the desk. Documents he had forged, boundaries he had redrawn, a fortune built on paper and blood. A wife, a tutor, for Kate's girl. Holloway set down his pen, slowly. He picked up his whiskey glass and turned it in the firelight, watching the amber liquid catch and glow. Why did they come down now, Nash? Could be just for the child. Holloway drank, set the glass down, looked at Virgil Nash for the first time. Or it could be for something else. His voice was quiet and pleasant. A church-going voice, a handshaking voice, the most dangerous voice in 3 counties. Kate knew something before she died. Find out what the Boston girl is, and watch that valley. Nash nodded and left. Holloway sat alone in the room that had belonged to Silas and Caleb's mother. On the wall behind him hung a family portrait painted when the boys were young. 2 dark-haired children standing beside parents who loved them in a house that was rightfully theirs. 8 years, Holloway said softly to the empty room. He finished his whiskey. You should have stayed on your mountain. And the clock, the invisible ticking clock that Evie and Silas and Caleb did not yet know was running, moved another notch toward midnight. The days found their rhythm the way rivers find their banks. Not all at once, but gradually, through repetition, through the slow, patient work of water against stone. Evie woke before dawn each morning. She cooked breakfast while the sky outside turned from black to gray to pale gold. Silas ate quickly and in silence, the way a man eats who considers food fuel and nothing more. Then he would take his rifle from the hook by the door, pull on his heavy coat, and disappear into the mountains to check his trap lines or hunt. He moved through the forest the way the forest itself moved, quietly, without apology. He was often gone from first light until the shadows grew long again. Caleb stayed closer. He split firewood in the yard with an axe that looked like a toy in his massive hands. He mended the fence around the chicken coop. He worked the small forge he had built behind the barn, repairing hinges and sharpening blades and making the small iron tools that kept the homestead alive. The ring of his hammer against the anvil became as much a part of the valley's music as the creek and the wind through the pines. And Rosie stayed with Evie. They began with letters. Evie scratched them in the dirt floor of the porch with a stick, then moved to charcoal on flat pieces of bark. A, B, C. Simple shapes that meant nothing until you strung them together, and then they meant everything. At first Rosie barely spoke, She would sit by the window with Daisy in her lap and stare at the mountains as if she were waiting for someone to come over the ridge. Her mother maybe, her father, someone who was never coming back. Evie recognized the posture. She had held it herself for years, so she did not push, she did not demand words, she simply made herself present. She sang silly songs while she cooked songs her father used to hum, while grading papers, songs with nonsense words that made Rosie look up from the window with something almost like curiosity. She told stories about the ocean in Boston, about waves that could knock you flat and salt that stuck to your skin for hours. She let Rosie braid her hair, which the child did with fierce concentration and very little skill, and Evie wore the crooked braids all day without fixing them. She taught Rosie to count with smooth stones from the creek. They would sit on this porch in the afternoon sun and sort them by size, by color, by the patterns the water had carved. 5 white ones, 3 gray ones, 2 with veins of quartz that caught the light like tiny lightning bolts. 7 plus 3, Evie would say. And one day, without looking up from her stones, Rosie whispered, 10. It was the first word she had offered freely, not pulled from her, not traded for something, given. And Evie held that small gift as carefully as she would have held a live coal because it burned the same way, with warmth, with promise, with the knowledge that something frozen was beginning to thaw. Weeks passed and Evie began to notice things. She noticed the way Silas cared for her. It was never direct, never spoken. He left food outside her bedroom door in the mornings when he rose before her. A biscuit wrapped in cloth, dried venison, once a small jar of honey he had traded for somewhere she never learned. He never handed these things to her. He left them, as if proximity were a language he did not trust himself to speak. He never entered a room where she was alone. If she was reading by the fire and he needed something from the shelf, he would wait in the doorway until she noticed him, or he would come back later. He kept physical distance, as if it were a promise made to himself, a line drawn not from coldness, but from a kind of fierce, almost painful respect. But the books told a different story. Each morning, whatever book Evie had been reading the night before would have a page marked with a thin strip of bark. And in the margins, in small careful pencil, there would be notes, not corrections, observations. A line drawn beside a passage about justice with the word disputed written next to it. A question mark beside a philosopher's claim about truth. Once beside a line in a French novel about a woman choosing her own fate, he had written simply, yes. He was reading alongside her, following the path of her mind through these books the way a tracker follows footprints through snow. He never mentioned the notes. She never asked. But each morning she opened the book and found his thoughts waiting beside hers, and the intimacy of it was so quiet and so deep that it frightened her more than any loud declaration could have. Caleb's care was different. It arrived with sound and heat and presence. He taught Rosie to sit on the old pony he kept behind the barn. He held the child steady with one hand while the pony walked slow circles, and Rosie's face, for the first time since Evie had known her, broke into something that was almost a smile. Caleb saw it and looked away fast, but not before Evie caught the shine in his dark eyes. He built Evie a writing desk from a slab of pine he had been drying in the barn. She came in one afternoon and found it beneath the window. The surface sanded smooth, the legs fitted together with the precision of a man who understood that care and craftsmanship were the same word wearing different clothes. He had stained it dark with walnut oil. It smelled like the forest. He brought wildflowers and put them in a tin cup on the kitchen table. Never said a word about them. Just replaced them every few days when they wilted. Purple columbine, white yarrow, tiny yellow blooms she did not know the name of. The cabin had been a place of function. Caleb was quietly turning it into a place of color. He talked more than Silas. He told stories while he worked about the animals he had seen in the high country, about the time a bull elk charged him and he had to climb a tree so fast he left his boots on the ground, about his life as a blacksmith's apprentice before everything changed. His voice was warm and rough and carried laughter inside it like sparks inside smoke. He teased Rosie gently and called her Little Bear, and pretended to be afraid when she growled at him, which made her giggle, which was a sound so rare and precious that all three adults would go still when it happened, as if a bird had landed on the windowsill and no one wanted to scare it away. But when Evie caught Caleb looking at her, which happened more often than she wanted to admit, his eyes were not gentle. They were not teasing. They were dark and deep and full of something held back under tremendous pressure, like water building behind a dam. He would hold her gaze for 1 second, 2, and then look away. Always away. Always first. One afternoon Evie sat at the kitchen table teaching Rosie to write her name. R-O-S-I-E. The child gripped the pencil like a weapon, her tongue between her teeth, concentrating with a ferocity that made Evie's heart ache. Caleb sat across the table mending a bridle. His hands worked the leather with automatic skill, his eyes down. Evie reached for the pencil Rosie had dropped, and her fingers brushed against Caleb's hand. They both went still. It was nothing. The lightest possible contact. Skin against skin for less than a heartbeat. But the shock of it traveled up Evie's arm and settled in her chest like a fist closing. Caleb's hand did not move. Then it did. He pulled away first, stood up, walked outside without a word. Rosie looked up from her letters. "Is Uncle Caleb okay?" "He is fine," Evie said. But her voice was not quite steady, and when she picked up the pencil, her hand was not quite still. That night she could not sleep. She rose and padded barefoot into the main room to get water. The fire was low but still alive, casting amber light across the walls and the shelves and the books. Silas sat in the chair beside the fireplace. He did not hear her, or if he did, he gave no sign. He held a book open in his lap, and even from the doorway, Evie could see it was the same French novel she had been reading. The same passage. His face in the firelight was different from the face he wore in daylight. The hard lines were softer. The stone was gone. Without the wall of coldness he carried like armor, without the beard and the silence and the carefully maintained distance, he looked almost, she thought, and the thought surprised her. Beautiful. Not handsome in the way men in cities are handsome. Not polished. Not arranged. Beautiful the way a mountain is beautiful. Stark and weathered and uncompromising and full of things you would spend a lifetime discovering. She went back to her room without the water. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to her own breathing and wondered when exactly the ground beneath her had begun to shift. 2 men, 2 languages of devotion, one written in silence and pencil marks, the other in wildflowers and wooden shelves, both pulling her in directions she had not planned to go. Then came the storm. It began in the mountains to the north. Silas saw it building that morning, a wall of cloud dark as bruised fruit rolling south along the peaks. He left to check his farthest trap line before it hit. Caleb watched his brother ride out with the creased forehead of a man who wanted to say, "Be careful," but had used up all his words for that kind of thing years ago. By noon, the first flakes were falling. By mid-afternoon, the valley had disappeared in white. Wind screamed down from the ridges and threw snow sideways against the cabin walls. Caleb brought the horses into the barn, stacked extra wood by the door, and pulled every blanket from the closet. "Bad one," he said, looking out the window at nothing but white. "Maybe 3 days." Rosie pressed close to Evie's side. Evie pulled the child onto her lap and held her. Silas did not come back. The afternoon became evening. Evening became night. The storm howled and shook the cabin like a living thing trying to get inside. Caleb sat by the door with his rifle across his knees, and Evie saw something in his face she had not seen before. Fear. Not for himself, for his brother. At 10 o'clock the door burst open. Silas fell through it in a shower of snow and cold air. He was covered head to foot in white, his beard crusted with ice, his coat stiff, and his right hand was wrapped in a bloody rag. He had slipped on a rock face in the whiteout and gashed his palm open on a sharp edge of granite. Caleb was on his feet instantly. He grabbed his brother by the shoulders, hauled him to the fire, stripped off the frozen coat. Silas let him. That alone told Evie how bad it was. Silas did not let people do things for him. Silas was the wall. Walls did not accept help. Sit, Caleb ordered. I am fine. Sit down, Silas. For once the older brother obeyed the younger. Evie heated water over the fire and knelt beside Silas with clean cloth torn from an old shirt. Let me see, she said. He hesitated. Then he held out his hand. This was the first time she had touched Silas since the ride from Denver. His hand was enormous, rough as tree bark, calloused across every finger and the heel of the palm. The gash ran from the base of his thumb to the center of his palm, deep but clean. Mountain granite cuts clean. She washed the wound carefully. She could feel the tension in his hand, in his arm, in his entire body. Every muscle locked, not from pain, from the contact. Her fingers on his skin, her face bent close to his hand, the firelight between them painting everything gold. She wrapped the wound with slow, careful movements. She tied the bandage firmly. She did not release his hand right away, and he did not pull it back. For 3 full heartbeats they stayed like that, her hands around his gray eyes on her face, the fire crackling, the storm screaming outside, and between them in the warm air of that small space something as fragile and undeniable as a heartbeat. Then Evie looked up. Caleb stood by the door. He was watching them. His face was very still. His jaw was tight. His eyes were dark, but not with anger, with recognition. The look of a man watching something he has been trying not to see finally become visible. He turned away and busied himself with the woodpile. He did not speak for the rest of the evening. The storm sealed them inside for 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and piling snow, and a world reduced to the size of 4 walls and a fire. 3 days where secrets could no longer hide because there was nowhere left to put them. It began on the first evening. Evie sat by the fire reading the French novel. Rosie was asleep. Caleb was mending a boot in the corner. Silas sat across from Evie with his bandaged hand resting on his knee. Evie read a passage aloud in French without thinking, a habit from childhood when her father would read to her in the language they shared like a private country. Silas responded, in French. Perfect, fluent, unaccented French. A comment on the passage so precise and thoughtful that Evie's hand stopped turning the page. "You speak French," she said. "My father taught me." "Where did you study?" A silence, long enough to fill with everything he had never said. "Harvard." The word struck her like a physical blow. She set the book down. "Harvard," she repeated. "I studied law. My father taught at Harvard." Silas went completely still. The fire popped. Snow hissed against the window. "William Harding," Silas said quietly. Evie's breath stopped. "You knew him. He lectured my class once, about justice, about the relationship between law and moral obligation." Silas paused. "Your father believed that truth always rises. You do not agree." "Not always." The word carried 8 years of exile in it. 8 years of being called a murderer. 8 years of living on a mountain because the truth had not risen. It had been buried alive and it was still underground. Caleb spoke from the corner. He had stopped mending the boot. His dark eyes were fixed on his brother. "Tell her," Caleb said. "She has a right to know." Silas looked at his brother for a long time. Then he looked at Evie. "A man was killed," he said. His voice was flat, the way you flatten your voice when the thing you are describing is too heavy for inflection. "His name was Jonathan Caldwell. He was found stabbed in our family's barn. I was found holding the knife." Evie felt her heart strike against her ribs. "Did you do it?" "No." No hesitation. No qualification. No. A single word laid down like a stone on solid ground. "I walked into the barn after it happened. The knife was on the ground beside him. I picked it up. A reflex. The wrong reflex. Men came running. They saw me, covered in his blood, holding the weapon." Caleb took over. His voice was harder than his brother's, hotter, the voice of a man who carried anger the way Silas carried silence, like a second skin. "Our father paid to keep Silas from hanging, but the deal was exile. Leave the territory. Never come back. The man who accused Silas, the man who pushed hardest for the conviction, was Garrett Holloway. Holloway. Evie filed the name away. It tasted like iron on her tongue. I followed my brother, Caleb continued. If an entire town was willing to believe Silas was a killer, I did not want to live in that town. He touched the scar on his face, traced it with one finger the way you trace a line on a map. The night before we left, 3 men came to punish Silas, friends of Holloway. They had a knife and a message. I took the knife instead of my brother. That is where this came from. Evie looked at that scar with new eyes. Not a mark of violence done, a mark of violence received. For love. I believe you, Evie said to Silas. The silence that followed was absolute. The fire did not crackle. The wind did not howl. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if the world itself needed a moment to understand what had just happened. Someone believed him. After 8 years of silence, after 8 years of exile, someone looked at the mountain man, the beast, the murderer, and said 3 words that no one else had said. I believe you. Something moved behind Silas's gray eyes, quick and bright and instantly controlled, like a fish leaping in a deep lake, there and gone. But Evie saw it, and she understood that she had just touched something inside this man that had not been touched in a very long time. On the second day of the storm, the larger truth came out. Rosie was napping. The 3 of them sat around the fire, and the silence had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people deciding how much to trust. Your sister, Evie said carefully. Catherine, how did she really die? Silas's jaw tightened. 6 months ago. She and her husband. They said it was a wagon accident. The axle broke on a mountain road. Wagon went over the edge. You do not believe it. No. Silas stared into the fire. My mother saw something the night Jonathan Caldwell was killed. She never told anyone because Holloway threatened our family, but she wrote it down, in a diary. She hid it in the ranch house. Evie leaned forward. What did she see? I do not know exactly. She died before she could tell us. But Kate found the diary. Kate wrote to me. She said it contained enough to clear my name, enough to destroy Holloway. And 2 weeks after she wrote that letter, Caleb said, his voice quiet and dangerous, Kate was dead, her husband with her, wagon accident. Convenient. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. Inside the cabin a different kind of storm was building. Garrett Holloway controls our family's ranch now, Silas said. Drummond Creek Ranch. It has been in our family for 2 generations. After Kate died, there was no one to contest his claim. He owns the land. He owns the house. He owns the barn where Jonathan Caldwell bled to death. And the diary. Still in the ranch house, hidden where my mother put it. Kate told me the exact location before she died. A loose brick in the fireplace of my mother's bedroom. Holloway does not know it exists. Then we go get it, Evie said. Both brothers looked at her. Silas with that flat gray stare that could mean anything. Caleb with his eyebrows raised and his mouth slightly open, the expression of a man who has just watched a house cat challenge a bear. It is dangerous, Silas said. So is living in fear. Holloway has men, guns, a judge in his pocket. And you have the truth, somewhere in that house written in your mother's hand. Silas shook his head slowly. Not disagreement. Disbelief. Why do you care? He asked. This is not your fight. You owe us nothing. Evie hesitated. The honest answer was complicated. It involved a little girl who asked, Does it hurt? And a man who wrote yes in the margins of a French novel, and another man who sewed a doll's arm at midnight, and a wall of books that should not exist in a cabin on a mountain, and the memory of her father saying that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. But the words that came out were simpler than all of that. Because Rosie deserves the truth, because you deserve your name, and because I believe you. The words hung in the warm air between them, heavy as stones, light as breath. Silas stepped closer to her. 1 step. It was the closest he had voluntarily come to her since they arrived at the cabin. No one else ever has, he said quietly. Believed me, "I am not everyone else," Evie said. For a long moment, neither moved. Snow howled outside. The fire painted their faces gold and shadow, and something fragile and powerful began to form in the space between them, like ice crystals forming on a window, delicate and intricate and strong enough if you left them alone to cover the entire pane. On the third day, the storm began to weaken. The wind lost its scream and settled into a moan, then a whisper, then silence. Silas went outside to dig out the porch, leaving Caleb and Evie alone with Rosie sleeping in the next room. Caleb sat repairing a door hinge. Evie sat near him reading. The quiet was comfortable, domestic, the kind of quiet that happens between people who have shared a small space long enough to stop performing. "You are not afraid of us," Caleb said suddenly. He did not look up from the hinge. "No." "Why?" Evie considered the question. "Because you are both more afraid of hurting me than I am of being hurt." Caleb's hand stopped. He looked at her. In the gray light from the window, the scar on his face lost its harshness. It became something else. A record, a receipt, proof of the kind of love that does not flinch. "I am not the good one," he said quietly. "Silas reads books and believes in justice. I break things and call it fair. Perhaps the world needs both." His eyes moved to her mouth, just for a moment, a flicker, quick as a candle in a draught. Then he looked away and stood up and walked outside, and the door closed behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam and not quite nothing. When the storm passed on the fourth morning, the valley was transformed, white and glittering and unblemished, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and hung out to dry. The sun came through the clouds with the kind of brilliance that hurts your eyes and makes you believe briefly that beauty might be enough. But beauty was not enough. Because the day Silas went to check his trap lines at the far edge of the valley, he found tracks. Horse tracks. At least 3 horses moving along the ridge above the cabin. Recent. Not hunters. Hunters follow game trails. These tracks followed the tree line, staying hidden, pausing at the points where you could look down into the valley and see the cabin and the barn and the smoke rising from the chimney. Someone had been watching. Silas came back early that day. His face was colder than the snow. He found Caleb in the barn and spoke in a low voice that Evie, standing at the kitchen window, strained to hear. "Holloway sent scouts." Caleb swore, a single word sharp as the crack of an axe. "He knows. He knows we were in Denver. He knows about Evie. News travels." "How long?" "The tracks are 2 days old, maybe 3, before the storm." They stood in the barn doorway, 2 brothers silhouetted against the white valley, and Evie watched them from the window and felt the cold creep in beneath the warmth she had been building for weeks. The clock she did not know was ticking had just gotten louder. The confrontation came 5 days after the storm broke. Evie was on the porch teaching Rosie to draw letters in the thin layer of remaining snow. S for snow, R for Rosie, D for Daisy. The child was concentrating so hard that her tongue poked out between her lips, and Evie was laughing at the way Rosie's letter S looked more like a snake having a bad day when she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming up the valley from the south. Her laughter died. She gathered Rosie behind her legs and stood. 3 riders crested the low rise at the valley's entrance. They rode in a line spaced apart the way men ride when they want you to know they are not in a hurry and they are not afraid. The man in front was thin, not lean the way Silas was lean, all muscle and purpose, thin the way a blade is thin. He had narrow eyes and a face built for surveillance. 2 pistols rode on his hips, worn low and forward, and his hands hung near them with the easy familiarity of a man who reached for his guns the way most people reached for their coffee. Virgil Nash. Silas appeared on the porch as if he had materialized from the wood itself, rifle in his hands, expression carved from granite. He positioned himself between Nash and Evie without seeming to move at all the way a mountain positions itself between the wind and the valley behind it. It was simply there. Caleb emerged from the barn, slower, his blacksmith's hammer in his right hand because his rifle was 20 feet away and 20 feet was too far. He did not look at his brother. He did not need to. They had been reading each other's positions for 30 years. Nash reined his horse to a stop 20 yards from the porch. His 2 men flanked him, hands near their weapons. Nobody drew, not yet. "Mr. Holloway sends his regards," Nash said pleasantly. He had a voice like a saw blade wrapped in silk, smooth on the surface, teeth underneath. "He is curious about why the Drummond brothers have come down from their mountain after all these years." "Tell Holloway we have no business with him," Silas said. Nash's eyes slid past Silas to Evie. They traveled over her slowly, the way a man examines something he is calculating the value of. "Heard you bought yourself a wife in Denver. Pretty." His lips pulled back from his teeth. Not a smile. An inventory. "Holloway says if you keep quiet and stay up here, he will leave you in peace." Caleb stepped forward. The hammer in his hand looked like it weighed nothing. "And if we do not keep quiet?" Nash looked at the scar on Caleb's face with the interest of a man studying another man's injury and wondering how to make a matching one. "Then next time, the knife will not just cut your face." His gaze dropped to Rosie peering around Evie's legs with wide, terrified eyes. Nash tilted his head. "The little one looks just like her mama. Sure hope she does not take after her mama in the luck department." Caleb erupted. He lunged forward 3 steps before Silas caught him with one arm across his chest, holding him back while keeping the rifle leveled at Nash with the other hand. Caleb fought against his brother's grip, the tendons in his neck standing out like cables, his eyes black with a fury that had nowhere to go. "Leave." Silas said the word like a bullet. "Now." Nash held up both hands in mock surrender. He gathered his reins and turned his horse. But as he rode, he looked back at Evie one final time. "Boston girl," he called, "you ought to know who you are standing next to." They watched the 3 riders disappear over the ridge. The valley absorbed the sound of hoofbeats and returned to silence. But it was a different silence now, the silence of a fuse that has been lit. Caleb was shaking, not with cold. With rage held so tight his entire body vibrated like a plucked string. Silas had not removed his arm from his brother's chest. He held him the way you hold a door against a hurricane, steady, braced, knowing the force behind it. And Rosie was crying. Small, quiet sobs pressed into Evie's skirt, the first tears she had shed since her parents died. Evie knelt and gathered the child into her arms and held her and rocked her and whispered things that might have been words or might have been just sounds, the kind of sounds that mean, "I am here," in every language. That night, after Rosie was asleep, the 3 of them sat around the fire, and the room was changed. The warmth was still there, but it had an edge to it now, like a blade beneath a blanket. "We cannot wait any longer," Evie said. "If we do not go for the diary, Holloway will come for us." Silas stared into the flames. "The Harvest Festival in Pine Ridge is in 2 weeks. Most of the town attends. The ranch will be nearly empty." "You truly would go with us," Caleb said. Not a question. "Yes." "You understand what that means?" "I understand." Silas studied her face in the firelight. "You are braver than you know." "No," Evie replied softly. "I am simply done being afraid." The 2 weeks of preparation became their own kind of story, a story told in bruises and blisters and small acts of trust. Silas taught Evie to shoot. They hiked above the tree line where the sound would not carry, and he stood behind her and positioned the rifle against her shoulder with hands so careful they might have been handling glass. The first shot kicked her backward and left a bruise the color of a thundercloud on her shoulder. She did not complain. She fired again. "You learn quickly," Silas said after she hit a pine cone at 40 yards. "I have a good teacher." Their eyes met across the barrel of the rifle, and something tightened between them like a rope being drawn taut. Evie could feel it in her sternum. Not fear, not attraction. Both. Neither. Something that had no name because it had never existed before. Caleb taught her to ride fast. He showed her how to lean into a gallop, how to turn a horse with her knees when her hands were full, how to drop from the saddle and disappear into brush if someone was following. He showed her the network of game trails and logging roads that threaded through the mountains around Pine Ridge exits and escape routes he had memorized as a boy. "If something goes wrong," he said, "do not wait for us. Ride north, follow the creek to Martha Calloway's place. She will keep you safe. I will not leave you behind. That is not your decision. I have already made it." He looked at her the way he always looked at her, that dark, hot gaze that was the opposite of his brother's cold, careful one. Where Silas's attention felt like snow falling, Caleb's felt like standing too close to a forge. Both could burn you. Both could save you. Silas drew a map of the ranch from memory. Every room, every door, every window. The location of his mother's bedroom, the fireplace, the loose brick on the left side third from the bottom. "Evie goes inside," Silas said, laying out the plan. "She is the only one of us they will not recognize immediately in Pine Ridge." "I go in with her," Caleb said. "Through the north woods. I know the way blind. I hold the perimeter. If anyone approaches, I handle it." They looked at each other across the map. Two brothers and the woman they had bought at auction for $250. A woman who was becoming something none of them had planned for. Martha Calloway arrived unannounced on a gray mare 6 days before the festival. She was 55 years old, with a face like a dried apple and a voice like gravel being poured into a bucket. She rode up into the valley alone and unarmed, and when Silas leveled his rifle at her from the porch, she squinted at him and said, "Put that down, Silas Drummond. I held you when you were still messing your diapers." Martha had been Eleanor Drummond's closest friend. She ran a boarding house in Pine Ridge and heard everything that moved through that town, which was everything, because small towns have no secrets, only secrets that are waiting to be told. She brought news. Holloway knew something was happening. Nash had hired 2 more guns. Men from outside the territory, which meant Holloway expected trouble and was willing to pay for the kind of trouble that carried badges from nowhere and answered to no one. But she also brought opportunity. Judge Roland Price would be at the festival as he was every year, and every year he drank himself unconscious by 9 o'clock. The ranch would be guarded by no more than 2 or 3 men. Martha agreed to keep Rosie safe during the operation. She looked at the child and her face softened, and when Rosie showed her the rag doll and said, "Uncle Caleb fixed Daisy's arm," Martha's eyes went bright and she turned away quickly and coughed and said something about dust in the air. Before she left, Martha caught Evie alone by the creek. "Listen to me carefully," the older woman said, her voice pitched low. "Eleanor wrote more than just the Caldwell business in that diary. There are things in there that could tear Pine Ridge apart at the foundations. Names, dates, land deals. If that book sees the light of day, Holloway is not the only one who falls." Evie felt the weight of those words settle on her like a coat made of lead. "How do you know what is in it?" "Because Eleanor was my friend, and she told me it existed. She just never told me where she hid it." Martha gripped Evie's arm. "Get that diary, child. Get it and do not let go. For Eleanor, for Kate. For those 2 boys who have been living like wolves because one man's greed stole everything from them." The night before they left the cabin was quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. The quiet of last things. The quiet that gathers before the shape of a life changes permanently, one way or the other. Rosie clung to Evie's skirt. "You will come back. I promise," Evie said, kneeling, so their eyes were level. "Promise, promise, promise, promise." Rosie hugged her. Arms tight around Evie's neck, face pressed into her shoulder, the fierce, desperate grip of a child who has already learned that people say, "I will be back," and sometimes they are not. Evie held her and breathed in the smell of her hair and made a promise to God or the mountains or whatever was listening that she would keep this one. Silas watched from the doorway. Caleb had already turned away his jaw, working his eyes wet and furious at themselves for being wet. Martha took Rosie to bed. In the morning she would carry the child north to the Patterson widow's house where Rosie would be safe no matter what happened at the ranch. The 3 of them were left beside the fire. The silence stretched. Then Silas spoke. "Thank you." "For what?" "For choosing to stay." Evie looked at him across the fire. The man who read French in the dark and wrote notes in the margins of her books and kept his distance as if closeness were a wound he was not ready to receive. "You bought me," she said. I did not have much choice." "We both know that is not true." Caleb stood up. "I will check the horses," he said. His voice was steady, but his movements were not. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the latch. He did not turn around. He stood there for 2 heartbeats, 3, as if there were something he needed to say and the words were stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. Then he opened the door and went out into the cold. He was leaving them alone. Deliberately, knowingly. The way you open a door for someone even when it is the room you wanted to enter yourself. And Evie felt that gesture cut deeper than any words because it told her that Caleb knew. He knew about the books and the notes and the way Silas looked at her when he thought no one was watching. And he was stepping aside, not without pain, not without cost, but stepping aside. Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was rough. His fingers were scarred. His hand was twice the size of hers and warm from the fire and trembling so slightly she would not have known it if she had not been holding on. "Evie," he said, "if something happens tomorrow, I need you to know something." Her heart was in her throat. "I have feelings for you, more than I should, more than I have a right to." She did not pull her hand away. "I know," she whispered. "I have them too." The words felt dangerous and right. At the same time, the way standing on the edge of a high place feels terrifying from the inside and beautiful from every other angle. He leaned forward, slowly, giving her time to stop him. She did not stop him. She leaned in to meet him. And when his lips touched hers, the kiss was careful, almost uncertain. The kiss of a man who had not kissed anyone in 8 years and had forgotten how it worked, but not how it felt. She answered it. And it changed, deepened, became something stronger and surer. The kind of kiss that builds itself as it goes, like a fire catching, like a river finding its course. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. His forehead rested against hers. His hand was still in her hair. The fire was low and the cabin was warm, and outside the mountains held everything in their ancient silence. "If we survive this," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with how he usually sounded, "I will ask you properly." She smiled through the heat rising in her cheeks. "And I will answer properly." But even as she said it, her eyes drifted toward the door. And through the window she could see Caleb standing on the porch with his back to the cabin, his shoulders rigid, his head tilted back toward the stars. He had heard, or he knew, and he was standing out there in the cold alone with everything he felt locked inside his chest like a fire in an iron stove. Burning, contained, burning. Something in Evie's heart cracked. Not broke, cracked, the way a frozen lake cracks in spring, because she understood with a clarity that frightened her that what she felt was not simple. It was not one thing pointed at one man. It was 2 things, 2 directions, 2 kinds of gravity pulling her toward 2 different centers, and she did not know which was stronger because they were both in their own ways exactly what she needed. She lay awake that night and listened to the wind. Tomorrow they would ride toward Pine Ridge, toward the ranch, toward the truth buried for 8 years. She pressed her hand against the diary's future hiding place against her ribs where it would rest tomorrow, and she thought about a woman named Eleanor who had written the truth down because she was too afraid to speak it, and another woman named Kate who had died for knowing where those words were kept. Tomorrow, Evie Harding, lot number 7, would go and bring those words into the light, and whatever happened after that, she would not bow her head. In the morning they saddled the horses. 3 riders heading south. Caleb rode in front. He had not spoken since the night before. His back was straight, his scar white against his skin in the cold morning light, and he did not look back. Not once. Silas and Evie rode together behind him, his warmth against her chest, her arms around his waist, the mountains around them white and gold in the rising sun. Nobody mentioned the kiss. Nobody mentioned Caleb standing alone on the porch. Nobody mentioned the way the air between the 3 of them had changed, charged now with something that could not be undone, because there were bigger things ahead, darker things, and the truth does not wait for hearts to sort themselves out. They rode toward Pine Ridge, toward the ranch, toward the diary that could set them free or get them killed. And not one of them knew that before the night was over, blood would be spilled, fire would devour what was left of the Drummond name, and one of them would nearly die to save the others. The mountains watched them go. The mountains always watch. They are patient that way. Pine Ridge was dressed for celebration and blind to what was coming. Paper lanterns hung from ropes strung between the storefronts on Main Street, casting pools of amber light across the packed dirt. A fiddle player sawed out a reel on the steps of the general store, while children chased each other between the legs of dancing couples. The smell of roasting pork and fresh bread drifted through the cool evening air, and the whole town hummed with the particular warmth of people who work hard and do not get to celebrate often enough. Evie stood at the edge of it wearing a borrowed dress. Martha Calloway had given it to her that afternoon, a simple gray cotton thing that was too big in the shoulders and too short in the hem, but served its purpose. With her hair pinned differently and a shawl across her chest, she looked like any ranch wife who had come to town for the festival. Nobody looked twice. Nobody knew. She scanned the crowd methodically. The way her father had taught her to read a room at Harvard faculty dinners, cataloging faces, noting who was talking to whom, measuring the spaces between people for what they revealed. There, Garrett Holloway stood near the entrance of the saloon in a charcoal vest and a clean white shirt, shaking hands with a cattle broker, laughing at something the man said. He looked like a deacon at a church picnic, respectable, generous, a pillar of the community, the most dangerous man in 3 counties dressed like your favorite uncle. And there, Judge Roland Price sat at a table outside the saloon with a bottle of bourbon already half empty, his red face shining in the lamplight. 9 o'clock would find him unconscious. It was barely 7:30, and he was already listing. And there at the end of the bar, visible through the saloon's open door, Virgil Nash sat nursing a whiskey. He sat alone. He sat still. His snake eyes moved across the room in slow sweeps, and Evie watched him for 3 full minutes before she was certain. Nash was not drinking. He lifted the glass. He touched it to his lips. He set it down. The level never changed. He was performing sobriety the way an actor performs grief, all the right gestures with nothing behind them. She felt the cold move through her gut like a swallowed stone. Evie found Caleb behind the livery stable where they had agreed to meet. He was crouched in the shadow of the building checking the cinch on his horse. Silas stood beside him, rifle in a leather scabbard strapped to his back, his dark coat blending with the dark. "Nash is not drinking," Evie said. The brothers exchanged a look. "He is pretending. He lifts the glass, but the whiskey stays the same level. He is watching the room." Caleb's jaw tightened. "He knows." "Or he suspects," Silas said. "It does not matter which. The plan does not change. We go now while Holloway is still here, or we do not go at all." Evie nodded. She had already decided. She had decided 3 weeks ago on an auction block in Denver when she chose not to bow her head, and every choice since then had been an extension of that first one, a straight line drawn from the platform to this alley to whatever came next. "I go inside," she said. "Caleb comes with me through the north woods. Silas holds the perimeter." Silas turned to Caleb. The lamplight from the street caught the edge of his face beneath the beard, and for a moment the 2 brothers simply looked at each other. No words. They did not need words. They had shared a mountain for 8 years and a silence much longer than that, and what passed between them in that look was the entire weight of brotherhood distilled into a single glance. "Protect her," Silas said. Caleb met his brother's eyes. "With my life." It was not a figure of speech. Both men knew it. Evie knew it, and the knowing sat in her chest like a burning coal. They separated. Silas melted into the darkness, heading east toward the ranch's main road. Caleb and Evie rode north, following a trail that was barely a trail, a faint suggestion carved through dense pine forest by deer, and by a boy who had grown up running these woods before exile taught him to run differently. They rode without speaking. The festival noise faded behind them, replaced by the sounds of the forest at night. Owl calls, the crack of branches under hoof, wind moving through the high canopy like breath through a sleeping mouth. The moon was 3/4 full, which gave enough light to see and not enough light to be seen, which was exactly what they needed. Drummond Creek Ranch appeared through the trees like a ghost. The main house was dark except for a single lamp burning in a downstairs window. The barn stood black against the sky. The bunkhouse showed no light. 2 horses were tied at the rail near the front porch, which meant 2 men inside, maybe 3. Caleb dismounted and tied the horses in a thicket of aspen 200 yards from the house. He moved through the dark with the absolute silence of a man who had learned that noise could kill you. Evie followed, placing her feet where he placed his breathing when he breathed. At the tree line he stopped, touched her arm, pointed. One guard on the front porch, sitting in a chair with a rifle across his knees and his chin on his chest, sleeping or close to it. Caleb held up one finger. Wait. He circled left through the shadows. Evie lost sight of him. The darkness swallowed him whole, and for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes she was alone in the trees with her heart slamming against her ribs and the diary's hiding place pulling at her like a magnet. A soft thud from the porch. A scrape. Then silence. Caleb appeared at the corner of the house. He gestured. Clear. The guard was unconscious on the porch floor, trussed with his own belt, a rag stuffed in his mouth. Caleb had not used a weapon. He had used his hands. The same hands that sewed rag dolls and hammered horseshoes had put a grown man to sleep without a sound. They found the second guard in the kitchen sitting at the table with a plate of cold beans and a half-empty bottle of rotgut. This one heard them. He stood. He reached for the pistol on the table. Caleb hit him once. A single blow open-handed to the side of the head. The man dropped like a sack of grain and did not move. Caleb flexed his hand and winced. "Go," he whispered. "I will watch the doors." Evie moved through the dark house like a woman walking through a dream. The hallway was narrow. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet despite her best efforts. She could smell dust and old wood and something faintly sweet like dried lavender, and she realized with a pang that the house still smelled like someone's mother. Eleanor Drummond's bedroom was at the back of the house on the 2nd floor. The door was closed but not locked. Evie pushed it open and stepped inside. Moonlight came through the window and painted everything silver. A bed with a faded quilt, a wardrobe with one door hanging open, a vanity with a cracked mirror, and a fireplace cold and dark, the stones gray with old ash. The room had not been touched. Holloway had taken the ranch, taken the land, taken everything the Drummond family had built over 2 generations, but he had not entered this room. Perhaps even a man like Holloway had limits. Or perhaps he simply never thought to look here. Evie knelt before the fireplace. Left side. 3rd brick from the bottom. She pressed it and felt it shift. Loose, just as Silas had said. She worked it free with her fingertips, the mortar crumbling like dry bread, and reached into the dark space behind. Her fingers closed around cloth. She pulled it out. A small bundle wrapped in oilskin. Inside a leather-bound diary, no bigger than a hymnal. She opened it to the first page and angled it toward the moonlight. Eleanor Drummond's handwriting. Small and careful and steady, the handwriting of a woman who understood that what she was putting on paper could save her son or destroy her family, or both. Evie's eyes moved fast. She did not have time to read every word. She scanned for names, dates, the architecture of the truth Eleanor had buried in this wall. April 15, 1875. She had written the date 3 times, as if the repetition could make the memory less terrible. I saw him. Garrett came through the barn door with blood on his hands and the knife still wet. Jonathan was on the ground, still breathing. Garrett knelt beside him and finished it. He looked up and saw me watching through the window. He pointed the knife at me and said nothing. He did not need to speak. I understood. Evie turned pages. Her hands were shaking. Jonathan discovered the forged land deeds. He confronted Garrett the day before. Garrett offered money. Jonathan refused. He said he would go to the marshal in Denver. That night he was dead and my son was holding the knife. More pages, more truth. Samuel Briggs, the surveyor. He found the boundary markers had been moved. He made new maps showing the original lines. Garrett invited him to supper. Briggs was never seen again. His horse was found 3 days later, saddled near the river crossing. They said he drowned. There was no body. Henry Cross, the lawyer representing the Pickford family and the Sanderson family in their land disputes with Garrett. Cross was found face down in Willow Creek, ruled accidental. The Pickfords lost their ranch. The Sandersons followed a year later. Judge Roland Price received 40 acres of bottomland from Garrett the month after Jonathan Caldwell's death. The deed is filed under Price's wife's maiden name. It took me 3 years to find it. Evie closed the diary. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped because something harder had replaced it. Not anger. Clarity. The cold, clear lens of understanding that comes when you finally see the shape of the thing you have been circling in the dark. This was not one murder. This was a system, a machine built of greed and violence and silence, oiled by a corrupt judge and maintained by fear. Garrett Holloway had not just killed Jonathan Caldwell, he had killed 3 men, stolen at least 4 ranches, destroyed families, exiled an innocent man for 8 years, murdered that man's sister to keep the machine running. Evie tucked the diary inside her dress flat against her ribs and buttoned her bodice over it. She stood. She turned toward the door. Virgil Nash was leaning against the doorframe. Behind him, 4 men with guns drawn stood in the narrow hallway. Their faces were hard and anonymous in the dark. Hired men, the kind you pay in cash and never learn the names of. Nash smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a trap springing shut. "Boston girl," he said, "I knew you Drummonds would come." The ranch had been bait. The empty rooms, the skeleton guard, the convenient timing of the festival. All of it arranged. Holloway had not left the ranch unprotected. He had left it open. A door with no lock and a wolf waiting behind it. Nash had left the saloon the moment Evie disappeared from the festival crowd. He had ridden hard and arrived through the east road while they entered from the north. The 2 guards Caleb had subdued were expendable. Nash was not. "The diary," Nash said, extending one thin hand. "Give it to me, and maybe I let you walk out of here with all your teeth." Evie pressed her arm against the diary beneath her dress. "I do not have any diary." Nash's smile widened. He stepped forward and backhanded her across the face. The blow snapped her head sideways. She tasted blood. Stars burst behind her eyes. But she did not fall. She locked her knees and stayed standing the way her father had taught her to stand, the way she had stood on the auction block, the way she would stand until someone cut her down. From somewhere below, a roar, not a word, a sound. The sound a wounded animal makes when it hears the thing it loves being hurt. Caleb came up the stairs like a landslide. He hit the first hired gun with his shoulder and sent the man crashing through the hallway wall in a shower of plaster and splintered wood. The second man swung a rifle butt at his head. Caleb caught it with one hand, ripped it away, and drove his fist into the man's chest hard enough to lift him off his feet. But there were 4 of them, and Caleb was already wounded. The gunshot came from the third man, a sharp crack in the enclosed hallway, and the bullet tore through the meat of Caleb's left shoulder, the same shoulder Nash's men had been watching for. Caleb staggered, kept fighting. He dropped the third man with an elbow to the temple. But the fourth man clubbed him from behind with a pistol barrel, and Caleb went down on one knee, then onto his face, and the hallway was suddenly full of men tying his wrists with rope, while blood pooled beneath his shoulder. Evie screamed. She did not know she was going to scream until she heard it come out of her raw and high and animal, a sound she had never made in her life. Nash grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. "Quiet," he said. His breath was warm and sour against her ear. "Or the next bullet goes in his head instead of his shoulder." They dragged Caleb downstairs. They dragged Evie after him. In the main room they bound them both to chairs. Caleb was bleeding badly. His face was gray beneath the soot and sweat. His dark eyes found Evie's across the room, and in them she saw something she had never seen there before. Not the fire, not the heat, guilt. He had failed to protect her, and the shame of it was worse than the bullet in his shoulder. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was thick. "Do not be," Evie answered. "You came for me." A commotion at the front door. Silas. He had heard the gunshot from his position on the perimeter and abandoned his post, which was exactly what Nash had wanted, and now Silas burst through the front door with his rifle up and ready and walked directly into the barrel of Nash's revolver pressed against Evie's temple. "Put it down, Drummond," Nash said calmly, "or she dies with your name on her lips." Silas stopped. His gray eyes went from Nash to Evie to the gun against her head. Something happened in those eyes that Evie would remember for the rest of her life. The stone cracked, the ice shattered, and beneath it was not cold at all. Beneath it was fire, the same fire that burned and Caleb held under a different kind of pressure compressed so tight it could split atoms. He lowered the rifle, set it on the floor, raised his hands. They tied him to the chair beside Caleb. 3 captives in their own family's house. The irony was not lost on any of them. Garrett Holloway arrived at midnight. He came through the front door the way a man enters his own home, which as far as the law was concerned it was. He removed his hat. He hung it on the hook by the door. He smoothed his silver hair with one hand and adjusted his vest with the other, and when he turned to face the 3 people tied to chairs in his parlor, he smiled the smile that Evie had seen him use at the festival. The deacon smile. The uncle smile. "The Drummond brothers," he said. 8 years on a mountain, and you still have not learned to leave well enough alone." His eyes moved to Evie. "And the girl they bought in Denver, lot number 7. He tilted his head, studying her the way you study an insect that has somehow gotten into your house. With curiosity, with mild annoyance, without the slightest trace of mercy. "I hear you are educated, Harvard man's daughter. That is almost a shame." "Where is the diary?" Holloway asked. "What diary?" Evie said. Her voice was level. Her cheek throbbed where Nash had hit her. Blood had dried on her lip. But her voice was level. Holloway nodded at Nash. Nash hit her again. Same cheek, harder. Caleb made a sound that was not human. He threw himself against the rope so violently that the chair scraped 6 inches across the floor. The hired men stepped back. Even Nash flinched. The force of Caleb Drummond trying to break free of his bonds was something you felt in the floor, in the walls, in the air itself. Raw and enormous and barely contained. Silas did not move, did not make a sound, but his eyes changed. They went past cold, past fury, past anything Evie had a word for, into a place that was perfectly still and perfectly lethal. The eyes of a man who was no longer calculating risk, who was no longer weighing options, who had crossed some internal border and arrived at a decision that nothing in the world could undo. "You know what happened to the last person who went looking for that diary," Holloway said. He was speaking to Evie, but watching the brothers. "Catherine Drummond. Sweet girl. She found out about it somehow. Wrote to her brother. Wanted to bring the truth to light." He paused, straightened his cufflinks. 2 weeks later her wagon went off a mountain road. Tragic accident. Everyone said so. "You killed her," Evie said. "I solved a problem. The way I have been solving problems for 8 years. The way I solved the problem of Jonathan Caldwell, who was foolish enough to threaten me with a sheaf of papers. The way I solved the problem of Samuel Briggs, who drew maps that showed things I did not want shown. The way I solved the problem of Henry Cross, who asked questions on behalf of families who should have kept their mouths shut." He spoke about murder the way other men spoke about bookkeeping. Calmly, methodically, as if the taking of human life were a line item in a ledger, a necessary expense in the business of acquisition. Evie stared at him across the room and understood with perfect clarity that Garrett Holloway was not a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had never had one. The morality others carried like a compass, the thing that pointed toward true north when the world spun, simply did not exist inside him. He was hollow at the center. The name fit. "The diary is inside my dress," Evie said quietly. Silas's head snapped toward her. Caleb made a strangled sound. Both brothers stared at her with identical expressions of horror. Nash stepped forward. Evie lifted her chin. Touch me, and I scream loud enough that whoever is riding the South Road hears it." Holloway raised a hand. Nash stopped. Evie looked directly at Holloway. "You are going to kill us regardless. We all know that. So let me say what I need to say before you do." Holloway was amused. She could see it in his eyes. The curiosity of a cat watching a mouse do something unexpected. "Go ahead, lot number 7. "My name," Evie said, and her voice was iron, now iron forged in the same fire that had shaped Caleb's horseshoes and Silas's silence and 8 years of exile, and a little girl who asked, "Does it hurt?" "Is Evelyn Harding. I am not a lot number. I am not something you price and sell and throw away when it breaks. I am the daughter of William Harding, who taught law at Harvard and believed the truth always rises, and the truth in that diary will not die with me." Holloway's smile faltered, just slightly, a hairline crack in the porcelain. "Because I already read it," Evie continued. "Every page, every name, every date. Jonathan Caldwell, Samuel Briggs, Henry Cross, Catherine Drummond, Judge Price's 40 acres filed under his wife's maiden name. I read it all. And I am not the only one who knows." This was a lie. Martha Calloway knew the diary existed but had not read it. But Holloway did not know that. And the seed of doubt once planted grows in soil made of guilt. Holloway's mask slipped for one full second. Beneath the silver hair and the deacon's smile and the pressed vest was something ugly and old and afraid. The face of a man who has built his house on bones and just felt the foundation shift. He recovered. He always recovered. Men like Holloway had been recovering from their own reflections for centuries. "Burn it," Holloway said to Nash. "Burn the house. Burn them in it." Nash hesitated. Burning a ranch house with 3 people inside was a different kind of crime than a knife in a barn or a wagon pushed off a road. This was the kind of thing that drew federal marshals. "Do it," Holloway repeated. His voice had lost its warmth. What remained was the voice underneath. Flat, cold, the real one. "By morning this will be ashes and a sad story about squatters who broke into a house and knocked over a lantern." Nash sent 2 men for kerosene. They found it in the barn, 4 cans meant for lanterns, and they began splashing it against the walls of the house. The smell hit Evie like a slap. Sharp. Chemical. The smell of a decision that could not be undone. But while Nash orchestrated the burning, while Holloway watched from the porch with the patience of a man who had waited 8 years and could wait 8 more, while kerosene soaked into the walls of a house that 3 generations of Drummonds had built with their hands, Martha Calloway was riding. She had not stayed at the cabin. She had delivered Rosie to the widow Patterson at the north end of the valley and doubled back because Martha Calloway was 55 years old and had been watching Garrett Holloway operate for a decade, and she did not trust plans that depended on things going right. She trusted plans that accounted for things going wrong. When she heard the gunshot from the direction of the ranch, she did not hesitate. She kicked her gray mare into a gallop and rode straight for Pine Ridge, straight for the festival, straight for the largest gathering of people within 30 miles. She arrived, sweating her horse, blowing her gray hair wild. She did not dismount. She rode directly into the center of Main Street, scattering dancers, and screamed with every ounce of air in her lungs. Garrett Holloway is burning Drummond Creek Ranch with people inside. He has the Drummond boys and the girl from Denver tied up in the house, and he is burning them alive. The fiddle stopped. The dancing stopped. For 3 heartbeats, Pine Ridge stood perfectly still. Then it broke in half. Some men looked at each other and shrugged. Drummond boys were trouble, always were. Some men looked at their wives, and their wives looked back, and something passed between them that needed no words. And some men, the kind of men who had worked alongside Jonathan Caldwell and hired Samuel Briggs and trusted Henry Cross with their legal affairs, some men felt a cold certainty settle in their guts like a stone finding the bottom of a well. Enough of them moved. Enough of them saddled horses and grabbed rifles and rode south toward the orange glow that was beginning to paint the underside of the clouds above Drummond Creek Ranch. Inside the house, the fire had started. It began in the kitchen. A low whoosh as the kerosene caught, followed by a rushing sound like wind through a narrow canyon. Smoke billowed through the doorway. Heat followed. The wallpaper in the hallway blistered and peeled. The floorboards began to groan. Caleb Drummond watched the fire come and felt something unlock inside his chest. Not panic, the opposite of panic. A calm so profound it was almost peaceful. The calm of a man who has decided what he is going to do and no longer needs to think about it. He was tied to a heavy oak chair. His shoulder was shot through. He had been beaten and bound and bled for the better part of an hour. But he was a blacksmith. He had spent his adult life bending iron to his will with nothing but heat and force and the absolute refusal to stop hitting until the metal did what he told it to do. He drew a breath. He closed his eyes. He gathered everything he had left, every ounce of strength and fury and love, and he pulled. The rope cut into his wrists. Blood ran freely. The chair groaned. The joints, stressed beyond their design, began to crack. Caleb pulled again, and this time he roared a sound that came from someplace deeper than his lungs, deeper than his chest. A sound that came from the place where his brother's innocence lived, and his sister's memory lived, and a little girl named Rosie lived, and a woman named Evie lived. A woman he loved, a woman his brother loved, a woman he would die for right now in this room if that was what the next 5 minutes required. The chair broke. The back splintered away from the seat. The ropes loosened enough for him to wrench one hand free, and once one hand was free the rest followed because Caleb Drummond with one free hand was more dangerous than most men with two. He untied Silas. The knots were tight, but Caleb's bleeding fingers found them and tore them apart with the same brute precision he used on everything. Silas stood. The brothers looked at each other across the smoke-filled room, and an entire conversation happened in the space of a heartbeat. They moved to Evie. Caleb's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline fading, the blood loss catching up. Silas untied her with steady fingers while the ceiling above them began to glow orange and the heat pressed down like a hand. "Go," Caleb said. He pushed Evie toward the window at the end of the hall, the one that faced north away from Nash and the fire. "Both of you, now." "We are not leaving without you," Evie said. Caleb looked at her. The scar on his face was lit by the fire, and his dark eyes held hers with everything he had never said and might never get to say. "Nash is in the front room. If he sees us go through the window, he shoots us in the back. Someone has to hold the hallway." "Caleb," Silas said. One word, his brother's name, spoken the way you speak a prayer when you know it might be the last one. "Take her and go." Caleb picked up a broken chair leg. It was not much of a weapon, but it was what he had. "I will be right behind you." They both knew he might not be. They both knew it, and Caleb smiled, and the smile was real, and it was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Evie had ever seen on a human face. The smile of a man who has found the hill he is willing to die on and feels no uncertainty about the choice. Silas grabbed Evie's arm. She fought him. She fought him for 3 full seconds, reaching for Caleb, because leaving him felt like tearing her own body in half. But Silas was stronger, and the smoke was thickening, and the fire was growing, and Caleb was already turning toward the front of the house where Nash's shadow moved through the orange light. Silas pulled Evie to the window. He smashed it open with his elbow. Glass and wood exploded outward. Cold night air rushed in, and the fire behind them surged, feeding on the new oxygen. He lifted her through the frame and dropped her into the snow 3 feet below, then followed. They landed in the cold and the dark and the silence, and behind them the house screamed with fire. From inside came the sounds of combat, breaking furniture, a gunshot, another, a roar that was unmistakably Caleb, followed by a crash that shook the walls. Then a different sound, a deep structural groan, the sound of a beam giving way, the sound of a ceiling surrendering to gravity and flame. Silas was running before the sound finished. Back around the house, back toward the front door. Evie screamed his name, but he did not stop because inside that burning house was his brother, and his brother was everything his brother had followed him into exile and taken a knife meant for his face and spent 8 years on a mountain because he would rather live as a wolf than live in a world that called Silas a murderer. The front wall of the house was fully engulfed. Flames climbed the clapboard siding like living things. Nash was gone, fled into the dark, when the fire outran his control. The 2 remaining hired guns had run with him. The porch was a curtain of flame. Silas went through it. He put his arms over his face and went through the fire the way he went through everything. Forward, without pause, without calculation. Forward. Inside was hell. The hallway was an oven. The ceiling had partially collapsed. Timbers lay across the floor like fallen giants wreathed in flame, and beneath one of them, pinned from the waist down by a beam that must have weighed 300 pounds, was Caleb. He was conscious. His face was black with soot. Burns ran up both arms where he had tried to shield himself. Nash lay unconscious 5 feet away, crumpled against the wall where Caleb's last punch had put him. "Go back," Caleb said when he saw Silas. "Get out." Silas did not answer. He crouched beside the beam and gripped it with both hands. The wood was hot enough to sear flesh. He pulled. The beam did not move. He repositioned, braced his shoulder against the wall, and pushed. The muscles in his back and legs and arms knotted into ropes. The beam shifted. 1 inch. 2. "Leave me," Caleb said. His voice was weaker. The smoke was filling his lungs. Silas pushed harder. 3 inches. 4. He made a sound that was not a word, but contained everything a word could have meant. Love, fury, refusal. The absolute unshakable certainty that he would die in this fire before he left his brother under this beam. The beam moved. Enough. Caleb dragged himself free with his one good arm, leaving skin on the burning floor as he crawled. Silas grabbed him under the arms and hauled him upright, and Caleb screamed, and the scream was swallowed by the roar of the fire. They went through the front wall together, through the flames, through the heat, through the collapsing porch that fell behind them like a drawbridge closing. They hit the ground and rolled, and Silas was on top of his brother, slapping out the flames on Caleb's coat, on his arms, on his hair, with hands that were already blistered and bleeding. "Do not die," Silas said. He was crying. Evie had never seen him cry. She had not believed he could, but the tears cut channels through the soot on his face, and his voice broke in a way she had not thought that voice could break. "Do not you dare die, Caleb. Do not you dare." Caleb's eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow and wrong. Burns covered his back and both arms. The gunshot wound in his shoulder had reopened and was bleeding freely into the snow. But he was breathing. He was alive. Evie fell to her knees beside them. She pressed her hands against Caleb's shoulder wound, applying pressure the way she had seen it done, and the blood was hot on her fingers, and the snow was cold on her knees, and the fire was consuming the house behind them, and the sky was full of sparks rising like inverse stars. The sound of hoofbeats reached them first, then torchlight, then voices. The people of Pine Ridge arriving too late to prevent the fire, but not too late to see its author standing in the yard. Garrett Holloway had not fled. He stood near the corral fence watching his solution burn, and when the first riders appeared at the end of the ranch road, he turned and faced them with the same composed expression he wore to church on Sundays. "These people broke into my property," Holloway said. His voice carried across the yard with practiced authority. "The Drummond brothers, trespassers, criminals. The fire was an accident caused by their own carelessness." It was a good lie, delivered well, with the confidence of a man who had been lying successfully for 8 years and saw no reason to believe tonight would be different. Evie stood up. Her hair was wild. Her face was bruised and bleeding where Nash had hit her. Her borrowed dress was torn and soot-stained and smelled of kerosene and blood. She was 24 years old, orphaned, penniless, purchased at auction for the price of 5 good horses. She stood up straight and lifted her chin. She reached inside her dress and pulled out the diary. It was warm from her body heat and intact despite everything. The oilskin wrapping had protected it from the blood and the smoke. "This," she said, and her voice carried the way Holloway's had carried but differently, with a quality that had nothing to do with practice and everything to do with conviction, "is the diary of Eleanor Drummond." The riders had stopped. Horses stamped and blew. Torchlight flickered across faces she did not know. Ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, wives who had followed on their own horses, children who had been dragged from the festival. The whole ragged fabric of Pine Ridge gathered in the yard of a burning ranch, looking at a battered girl holding a small leather book. In this diary, Evie continued, Eleanor Drummond writes that she witnessed Garrett Holloway stab Jonathan Caldwell to death on the night of April 15, 1875. Jonathan discovered that Holloway had forged land deeds to steal the Drummond Ranch and 3 neighboring properties. Jonathan confronted him. Holloway killed him for it. The murmur that moved through the crowd was like wind moving through tall grass. Heads turned, eyes shifted. People who had lived beside Garrett Holloway for years looked at him with the first faint shadow of doubt. Silas Drummond entered the barn after Holloway had already left. He found the body. He picked up the knife. It was a reflex, the wrong reflex, and for that reflex he has been called a murderer for 8 years. She turned a page. Her hands were steady. Holloway also killed Samuel Briggs, the surveyor. Briggs discovered that the boundary markers on 6 properties had been moved. He made new maps. He was going to take them to the federal land office in Denver. He disappeared. His horse was found by the river. There was no body because Holloway made sure there would be no body. The crowd was quiet now, the kind of quiet that has weight. Henry Cross, the lawyer. He represented the Pickford family and the Sanderson family in their land disputes with Holloway. He asked questions. He filed papers. He was found face down in Willow Creek, ruled accidental drowning. The Pickfords lost their ranch. The Sandersons lost theirs. Holloway acquired both properties within a year. A woman in the crowd made a sound, small, sharp, the sound of a wound reopening. And 6 months ago, Catherine Drummond Hayes, Holloway's own neighbor, she found this diary. She contacted her brother. She was going to bring the truth to light. Evie paused. 2 weeks later, her wagon went off a mountain road. Her husband died with her. Their daughter Rosie, 6 years old, was left an orphan. The crowd was no longer a crowd. It was something else. A jury, a congregation, a body of people shifting from one understanding of the world to another, and the shift was visible, physical, a collective straightening of spines. Holloway's composure cracked. Not gradually, all at once. The deacon's mask fell away, and what was underneath was small and furious and cornered. "She is a liar," he shouted. His voice was different now, stripped of its warmth, shrill, the voice of a man who has been polite for so long that he has forgotten how to sound like himself. "She is a whore they bought at auction for $250, lot number 7. You are going to believe lot number 7 over me." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Evie had ever heard. Then Martha Calloway stepped forward from the back of the crowd. She was still on her horse, gray hair, wild face flushed from riding. "I believe her," Martha said. "Eleanor Drummond was my dearest friend. She told me she had written the truth down. She told me she had hidden it. She was afraid to speak because Holloway threatened her family, but she was not afraid to write." A rancher near the front, old, weathered, a man who had worked this valley for 40 years. "Sam Briggs surveyed my north pasture the month before he disappeared. He told me the boundary markers had been moved. He told me the land records in town did not match what was on the ground. I did not listen. God forgive me, I did not listen." A woman with a child on her hip. "Henry Cross was our lawyer. He was helping my husband fight for our property. After Cross died, there was no one left to fight. We lost everything, our home, our cattle. My husband works at the mine now. He used to own a ranch." One voice, then another, then 5, then 10. People who had swallowed doubts and ignored coincidences and accepted comfortable lies because comfortable lies are so much easier than uncomfortable truths. The dam broke. The water came through, and the water was made of names: Samuel Briggs, Henry Cross, Catherine Drummond, Jonathan Caldwell. Names that had been buried and were now rising the way William Harding had always believed the truth would rise, not because truth is strong, but because lies eventually grow too heavy to carry. Judge Price, who had been dragged from the festival by a man who had him by the collar, tried to slip away through the edge of the crowd. Caleb, who had regained consciousness and was propped against Silas's shoulder, saw him. "Price," Caleb called. His voice was raw and barely louder than a whisper, but in that silence it carried like a bell. "Page 47. 40 acres of bottomland, filed under your wife's maiden name, a month after Caldwell died." Price froze. Then he ran. He made it 4 steps before 3 men from the crowd had him by the arms. Holloway looked at the faces around him, the faces he had smiled at for years, the faces he had shaken hands with and lied to and stolen from. He looked at them, and he saw what they saw, and what they saw was him. He drew his revolver. He raised it toward Evie. "If I hang," Holloway said, and his voice was perfectly calm, perfectly steady. The mask back in place one final time. "She hangs first." Silas stepped in front of Evie, his body between her and the gun, broad and solid and immovable. Caleb dragged himself to his feet. He stood beside his brother, swaying, bleeding, burned. His body between Evie and the gun, broken and defiant, and standing only because lying down was not something he knew how to do. 2 brothers, 2 walls, built around the same woman. But the bullet never came. An old miner near the front of the crowd raised his rifle. Then the rancher beside him. Then a woman with a shotgun who had been married to a man who lost his ranch to Holloway's forged deeds. Then 5 more. Then 10. The people of Pine Ridge who had been silent for 8 years, who had swallowed their doubts and buried their questions and looked away when their neighbors disappeared, raised their weapons and pointed them at the man who had fed on their silence like a parasite feeds on a host. Holloway saw it. All of it. The rifles, the faces, the end of everything he had built, and something in him collapsed, not dramatically, quietly. The way a house settles into its foundation after the ground beneath it shifts. He lowered the revolver. His hand opened. The gun fell into the dirt. He went to his knees. It was over. The weeks that followed moved with the particular rhythm of aftermath, the slow, unsteady pace of a world rearranging itself after a long deception. Holloway and Price were taken to the Pine Ridge jail and held under guard until federal marshals arrived from Denver. The diary, combined with Martha Calloway's testimony and the land records that a suddenly cooperative county clerk produced from his files, was more than enough. The machine Holloway had built over 8 years dismantled itself in a matter of days, the way machines do when you remove the single gear that holds them together. In Holloway's case, the gear was fear, and fear once broken does not reassemble. Nash's body was found in the ashes of the ranch house 2 days after the fire. He had not made it out. The hired guns had vanished into the territory and were never found, which was probably for the best, since the territory was large enough to swallow men who did not wish to be seen. Drummond Creek Ranch, or what remained of it, was returned to the Drummond family by order of the territorial court. The land was intact. The barn survived. The house did not. But houses can be rebuilt. Names take longer, and Silas Drummond's name was cleared formally in a hearing that lasted 20 minutes, because some truths once spoken do not require much time to be believed. Caleb healed slowly. The doctor in Pine Ridge, a quiet man named Fletcher, who had the steady hands and limited conversation that make for the best kind of physician, treated the burns on his back and arms and the gunshot wound in his shoulder with a combination of carbolic salve and frankness. "You will have scars," Fletcher told him. "I know about scars," Caleb said. Evie changed his bandages twice a day. She boiled the cloth strips and let them cool and wrapped them around his wounds with the careful precision her father had used when handling rare books. Each morning, each evening, her hands on his skin, his breath against her hair when she leaned close. One morning, as she unwound the old bandage from his shoulder, Caleb caught her hand and held it. His grip was weak. His fingers were wrapped in gauze, but he held on with the determination of a man gripping a rope over a long fall. "Evie." "Caleb." He searched her face. All the things he had not said were there in his eyes, clear as print on a page. The wildflowers on the kitchen table, the bookshelf in her room, the way he had stepped outside the night Silas kissed her and stood alone on the porch under the stars and did not break. The way he had charged up those stairs when Nash hit her shoulder already bleeding because hearing her scream was worse than any bullet. "I know my brother," he began. "Do not say it," Evie whispered. "Not harshly, gently, the way you close a door that is not ready to be opened yet. Not now." He nodded. He released her hand. But his eyes stayed on hers for 3 more heartbeats, and in those heartbeats the space between them was not empty. It was full of something neither of them was ready to name. Rosie came home on a Tuesday. Martha Calloway brought her down from the Patterson widow's house on the back of the gray mare, and the child saw Evie standing in the yard of the temporary cabin the townspeople had helped build on the ranch property, and she was off that horse and running before Martha could stop her. Rosie hit Evie at full speed, small arms around her waist, face pressed into her stomach, the fierce grip of a child who has been promised something and received it. "You came back," Rosie said. Her voice was muffled by Evie's dress. "You promised, and you came back." "I promised," Evie said. She was crying. For the first time since the night of the fire. For the first time since the auction. For the first time since her mother died, really. Years of unshed tears, a reservoir she had held behind a dam of dignity and determination, broke through. She knelt in the dirt and held the child and wept. Silas watched from the porch. Caleb watched from the chair where he was recovering, his burned hands resting on his knees, his dark eyes bright. They decided together. The 3 of them sitting around the table in the temporary cabin, Rosie asleep in the next room. The ranch for winter and for Rosie's schooling because the child deserved learning and friends and the kind of normal that had been stolen from her. The mountain cabin for summer because Caleb needed the high places the way other men needed churches, and because the valley where they had first become a family would always be home. Both places, both lives, no one left behind. The evening before Martha returned to Pine Ridge for the last time, the 3 of them sat on the porch of the new cabin. The sky was clear. The stars were out. The same stars that had watched them on their first night together when 3 strangers shared a fire and began the slow, uncertain work of becoming something else. Silas sat to Evie's left, Caleb to her right, his bandaged arm resting carefully on the arm of his chair. The silence between them had changed again. It was no longer the silence of strangers, or the silence of secrets, or the silence of things left unsaid. It was the silence of people who have been through fire together and come out the other side scarred but standing. "I told you I would ask properly," Silas said. Evie looked at him. His gray eyes were soft in the starlight. The stone was gone. The ice was gone. What remained was the man who wrote notes in the margins of French novels and read fairy tales to a sleeping child and walked through fire to pull his brother free. She looked at Caleb. The scar on his face was silver in the moonlight. His dark eyes held hers with the steady heat of banked coals. The man who built bookshelves and brought wildflowers and took a knife for his brother and a bullet for a woman he loved and never once asked for anything in return. "Ask," Evie said. "Stay with us." With. Not me. Us. The word carried everything. 2 brothers who had shared a mountain and a silence and an exile. 2 men who loved the same woman and had somewhere in the crucible of the past 3 weeks stopped seeing that as a competition and started seeing it as a country with room for all of them. Caleb looked at his brother. Something passed between them. Not rivalry, not resignation, recognition. The understanding that what they were offering was strange and unprecedented and would require its own kind of courage. The understanding that they were finally, after years of being 2 halves, looking for a whole complete. Evie reached to her left and took Silas's hand. Large, rough, still healing from the burns. She reached to her right and took Caleb's, bandaged, warm, trembling slightly, though he would deny it. "I already stayed," she said. Then, because the words needed saying, because she had spent her life being defined by other people's decisions, and this one was hers entirely and completely hers, she said the thing that lot number 7 was never supposed to say. I was not sold. I was not bought. I chose this. I choose you. Both of you. This is my home. The stars watched. The mountains listened. The creek below the cabin ran on and on in its ancient, patient way, carrying snowmelt from the peaks to the valleys below, and the sound of it was the sound of something continuing, something that had survived. A letter arrived a week later, from a law firm in Denver. The Holloway case would go to federal court because the forged land deeds crossed county lines. There would be depositions, testimony, a trial that could take months. Silas read the letter on the porch. He folded it slowly. Evie came to stand beside him. "Not finished?" she asked. "Not yet, but we are not alone anymore." From the yard, Caleb's voice with Rosie on his good shoulder, "Whenever it is done, it is done. Tonight I am grilling venison, and nobody is going to talk about courts." Rosie giggled. The sound floated across the yard like a bird taking flight. Evie watched them, the scarred mountain man with the burned hands, carrying a 6-year-old girl who had forgotten how to laugh and was remembering, and she smiled. The cabin sat in its valley. Smoke rose from the chimney. The creek ran clear. Rosie played in the yard with Daisy, whose arm Caleb had sewn back on so neatly you could barely see the stitches. Silas read on the porch a French novel. Caleb split wood despite the bandages because Caleb Drummond did not know how to sit still and probably never would. And Evie stood in the doorway wearing the blue cotton dress with white flowers along the hem. Martha had repaired it. The stains were gone. The torn hem was straight. It fit her differently now. Not because the dress had changed, but because the woman inside it had. 3 weeks ago she had been lot number 7. A price tag where a name should be. A woman sold for the cost of 5 good horses to 2 mountain men that an entire town feared. Now she was Evie Harding, daughter of a professor who believed truth rises, sister to a child who was learning to laugh again, beloved of 2 brothers who showed their love in different languages, one in silence and pencil marks, the other in wildflowers and forged iron. A woman who had walked into fire and come out carrying the truth in her hands. And here is the thing worth carrying with you when this story ends. Sometimes the bravest choice is not the loud one, not the fight, not the gunshot or the burning house or the speech before a crowd. Sometimes the bravest choice is the quiet one, the choice to stay when everything tells you to run, to stay when the world says you do not belong, to stay when your heart says this is home and your mind says this is madness, and you choose the heart anyway because the heart knows doors the mind cannot see. Evie Harding was lot number 7. She was priced at $50 and sold for $250, the cost of a good horse, the cost of a life. And she turned it into a beginning. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you chose to stay when it would have been easier to leave? When was the last time you stood up for someone who could not stand for themselves? When was the last time you looked at the truth, even when it was ugly, even when it was heavy, even when carrying it meant walking through fire, and you picked it up anyway? If this story meant something to you, a like helps more than you might think. If you know someone carrying something heavy in silence, share this with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? I read every single one. Because one honest choice turned lot number 7 into home. And it is never too late to choose a better way forward.